Behind the face we wore at the King's Arch, there was always a man thinking. People forget that. They look at the bearskin and the red wool and the white gloves, and they decide there is nothing inside but starch and obedience, a coat hung on a frame for tourists to photograph. I let them think it. For 19 years I let them think it, and I will tell you now that the letting was the hardest soldiering I ever did. I should tell you my name since I am the one talking. Owen Marsh. Sergeant, King's Own Foot Guards of Vasmark, King's Arch Detachment, Aldsworth. I stood that gate through 19 winters, and I have a knee that still tells me when the weather is turning. But there is a part of my life that appears in no program of ceremony, that the tour guides never mention, that I myself went years without saying aloud. I will come to it. A man should earn the right to be surprised by a story, and you have not earned it yet. Let me give you the cold first, because the cold is where it starts. That winter was the hardest Aldsworth had seen in a generation. The fountains in the Ashford court froze solid, and the groundsmen gave up chipping them and let them stand like gray glass. The wind came off the river, and through the King's Arch the way water finds a crack, patient and total, and it sat in the wool of the tunic and would not leave. We stood our 2 hours and were relieved and stood them again. You learn, on a post like that, to make your mind a long, flat country with very little weather in it. You learn to stop being cold by refusing to discuss it with yourself. I had got good at that. I had got good at a great many kinds of stillness. The Carthan delegation came in the 2nd week of that frost. You will not have heard of Carthan, and that is as it should be, because nothing in this story belongs to any real place or any real man, and I will name no kingdom that you could find on a map. Carthan was a power to our east, an old rival turned uneasy friend, the kind of neighbor a country watches even while it dines with him. There had been a war between us once, long before, and then there had been a peace, and the peace had to be renewed every so often the way a roof has to be reletted, with men in good coats signing their names under a great deal of gilt. That was the business of the visit. The treaty of 40 years was coming due, and the Carthan vanguard sent a delegation to Aldsworth to put their names beside ours, and the King of Vasmark, old King Aldrich, who I served and will not gossip about, received them with every honor the household could mount. Every honor meant us. The King's Arch is the ceremonial face of Aldsworth, and when a foreign power arrives by the river road and comes up through the gardens, it is the King's Arch and the men beneath it they see first. We were turned out that morning to a standard I have rarely matched since. Bearskins brushed against the grain and set true, brass that you could have shaved in. Every chin strap level, every man at the same height as if we had been cast rather than born. We stood in the iron cold and the river fog, and we were, I will say it without vanity, a wall worth looking at. The Carthan officers came up the road in 3 motor cars, and they came out of them already laughing. I do not mean they were rude men, all of them. Most soldiers are not. There was an old general among them, white-headed, slow getting out of the car, who looked up at the arch and at us and went very quiet and still in a way I noticed even then without knowing why. There is a stillness men learn only one way, and he had it, and a part of me recognized a part of him, the way you recognize a man's regiment by how he ties his boots. But I had no time to think about the old general, because the man at the head of the delegation took up all the air in the courtyard the moment his shoe touched the stone. Colonel Reinhard Stull. I learned his name within the hour because he made certain everyone learned it. He was a tall man, well-made, somewhere near 50, with the kind of decorated chest that tells you a man has been brave and then tells you if you keep looking, that he would very much like you to keep looking. He had a face built for contempt, the long jaw, the slightly lowered eyelids, the small permanent set to the mouth that says I have already weighed you and you came up short. He wore his ribbons the way some men wear a watch to be seen checking them, and he looked at us, at the bearskins, at the brass, at the still red rank of us under the arch, and his mouth did the small thing it did, and he said something to the officer beside him, and the officer laughed. He said it in Carthan, but Carthan and Vasmark are cousins of a tongue, and I have enough to follow a sneer. He said, "Look at the dolls. They keep them wound up at the door." I did not move. That is the whole of my craft if you want to know it. I did not move. They went in, the delegation, up the steps and through the great doors to where the king and his ministers waited, and we held the arch, and the cold went on, and I thought the worst of it was a phrase I half understood and would forget by relief. I was wrong about that the way a man is wrong about a small cut that turns, days later, into the thing that lays him up. Because Colonel Stahl came back. It was the second day of the visit, mid-morning, and the delegation was being walked through the gardens and the state rooms, the way you walk important guests so they feel they have seen a country when they have seen a hallway. Stahl had detached himself from the tour. He came across the Ashford court alone, hands behind his back, in no hurry, in the manner of a man who owns the time of everyone he is about to spend it on. He came to the arch. He came to me. And he stopped a pace too close, the way a man does when he wants you to know he has decided the rules of distance do not bind him, and he looked up into my face under the bearskin with frank, open enjoyment. "I want you to understand that I was on duty, and that on duty a man of my regiment does not speak, does not turn his head, does not meet a stare, does not so much as let his eyes settle on a face. We are taught to look at the middle distance and hold it like a horizon." So I looked at the middle distance, which happened, that morning, to be a frozen fountain and a bare lime tree, and Colonel Stahl stood in the bottom edge of my vision, and studied me the way a boy studies an insect he has decided to bother. "You don't blink much," he said. He said it in our tongue, accented but clear so that any of the household staff passing would understand and be part of it. "Do they teach you that, or are you simply empty in there?" I held the horizon. He smiled. He walked a slow half-circle around me, looking me up and down, and he reached out and flicked the brim of his glove against one of my brass buttons. Tink, a small, bright, insolent sound, and he watched my face for the flinch that did not come. "I have spent 30 years in real armies," he said, conversational, almost kind. "I have stood where men were trying to kill me, and I look at you, at all of you, in your hats and your toy rifles, and I think, here is a country that has forgotten what a soldier is for. You are a costume. You are a thing they hang at the gate so the visitors feel safe. You have never in your life smelled powder, have you? You would not know which way the round leaves the barrel." I held the horizon. The fountain was gray glass. The lime tree had a single black leaf still clinging to it that the frost had not taken. I gave my whole attention to that leaf, which is a trick, a way of putting the mind somewhere the man cannot reach. He did not like getting nothing back. They never do. The contempt was supposed to be a transaction. He gives the insult, you give the flinch, and he keeps the flinch like a coin. When the coin does not come, a certain kind of man feels cheated, and he raises the price. "Present arms," he said. It was an order. It was also a trap, and I knew it the way you know a hole in the ice by the color. Present arms is a movement of ceremony, a salute rendered to specific persons on specific occasions, and a foreign colonel standing in a courtyard idly is not one of them. If I performed it on his word, I would be a doll wound up by a stranger, and he would have proved his whole sneer in a single motion that 100 phones in the gardens would have caught. If I refused, if I so much as let my refusal show as refusal, I would be a sullen, ornamental man embarrassing the household before a guest of the king. He had built a little box with 2 doors, and both of them opened onto his laughter. So I took neither door. I did the only thing a guardsman can do, which is the thing we are actually for. I stood. I rendered him nothing, which is not the same as refusing him something, and the difference is the whole of the discipline. And it is invisible to a man who has never had to learn it. I stood as I would have stood if he had been the lime tree, or the fog, or the cold itself, a fact of weather to be outlasted. His smile thinned. He stepped back. He looked at me a moment longer, and something went across his face that I have thought about many times since, because it was not quite contempt anymore. It was the small irritation of a man who has met a door that does not open and has begun, without admitting it, to wonder what is behind it. Would, he said, deciding to call it a victory anyway. All the way through. And he turned and walked back across the frozen court to rejoin the tour, and somewhere behind a hedge a young attaché laughed, and a member of the household staff who had stopped to watch hurried on with her face down, ashamed for me, or perhaps for the country, and I stood my post and watched the black leaf on the lime tree and did not move until I was relieved. That was the first day of it. I want to be honest that it stung. A man does not stop being a man because he has learned to hold still. But I had a thing inside me that morning that Colonel Stahl did not have, which was the knowledge of what I was, set against the noise of what he thought I was, and a quiet man can stand a great deal of weather if he knows the weather is wrong. I will tell you what I was now. I think you have earned a little of it. Before the gate there was a war. Not the old war between our countries, a later, smaller, uglier one, in the mountains to the south where Vazmark and Carthen, for once, fought on the same side against a thing that threatened them both. You will not find me in the histories of it under my own name. You will find me, if you look in the right places, under a name that is not a name, a thing the men took to calling a single Vazmark soldier on a single ridge over a single town. They called him the Marksman of Karrenhold. They wrote him into the war colleges. They were still teaching him, last I heard, in lecture halls in 2 countries, the shot that ended the siege of Karrenhold. Karrenhold was a town in a bowl of mountains, and it had been under siege for 11 weeks, and the men inside it were dying slowly of the slow things, hunger, cold, the small infections that finish what the shells start. The relief could not come up the valley because a single enemy gun, set on the high shoulder of the eastern ridge, ranged the whole road, and every column that tried it died in the open, and after 3 columns died one would order a 4th, and Karrenhold went on dying inside its bowl while the generals argued. The gun was the whole war. Take the gun and the road opens and the town lives. But the gun was 1,100 meters up a bare slope with no cover, sighted by a man who knew his trade, and it could not be rushed and it could not be flanked, and the weather would not let the aircraft up. I was a young man then, and I had a gift I had not asked for and was not proud of, which is that I could put a round where I looked at a distance other men called impossible. I had been quiet about it my whole life, the way you are quiet about a thing that frightens you a little. They came and got me off another part of the line, and they walked me up the back of the western ridge in the dark, 2 days of climbing, and they put me in a scrape of rock at a range that no sane man takes, and they said, if you can reach the crew of that gun, the road opens, and if you cannot, Karrenhold dies, and we will not ask you twice. I lay there through a whole night and a whole gray day, working the wind, working the light, working the cold that made my hands strangers to me, and I will not tell you the rest in any detail because it is not a story I tell for the drama of it. I will tell you only that there was a single shot, and that the road opened, and that the relief came up the valley the next morning, and that the men of Karrenhold lived who would not otherwise have lived, and that I came down off the western ridge and was sick behind a rock, and never fired a service rifle in anger again as long as I lived. I did not want the medals. I took the post at the King's Arch the way some men take a monastery, for the silence of it, for the discipline, for a place where the only thing asked of me was to stand and not to do the other thing ever again. They let me keep my name off it. The Marksman of Karrenhold became a legend in the colleges, a textbook problem in wind and elevation and nerve, and the legend did me the great kindness of not having my face. I was glad of that. I had stood at the King's Arch for 19 years, and the one round I fired in the mountains had not followed me through the gate. And now there was a foreign colonel in the Ashford court, calling me a toy soldier who had never smelled powder. You will think I wanted to tell him. I did not. I want to be very clear about that because it is the heart of the whole thing. A man does not carry what I carried by needing strangers to know he carries it. The wanting to be known is its own kind of weakness, and I had spent 19 years not feeding it, and one arrogant colonel was not going to make me feed it now. The shot at Karrenhold was the loudest thing I had ever done in my life, and I had spent every day since learning to be quiet, and the quiet was the harder discipline of the two and the one I was prouder of. So I held the gate, and I let him think me would, and I told no one. But the visit went on for 5 days, and Colonel Stahl made the host guards his amusement for the whole of it. It became a thing he did. He would find a reason to pass the arch, to detour through the court where we stood the inner posts, to walk the corridor where a sentry held the door to the long gallery, and he would perform a little for whatever of the delegation was with him. A remark, a circle walked around a still man, the glove flicked at a button. The dolls, the museum, the costume army. He had a real gift for it, the cruelty of a clever man who has decided that humiliating someone who cannot answer is a kind of wit. And because he was a guest of the king, and because we were what we were, no answer came, and his confidence grew the way a fire grows on a still day, feeding on the very calm around it. The young men of the detachment took it hard. There was a lance corporal, daily, 18 and proud and new to the bearskin, who came off his post on the 3rd evening with his jaw set and tears of fury he was too disciplined to shed standing in his eyes, and he found me in the guardroom and he said, "Sergeant, I cannot stand there and let that man, I cannot." He flicked his glove in Webb's face today, in his face, and Webb just took it. We just take it, it's not right. I made him a mug of the bad guardroom tea, and I made him sit down, and I said the thing I most needed him to understand, which I will give you the way I gave it to him. "Daily," I said, "the discipline isn't standing still because you have nothing in you. Any post can hold a man with nothing in him. The discipline is standing still because you have something in you and choosing not to spend it on a fool. He wants you to answer because the answer is the only thing that would make him real. Right now he's shouting at a wall, and a wall is a terrible thing to shout at because it gives you nothing back, and you start, after a while, to look mad. Let him look mad. The country isn't watching him. The country is watching whether we hold, so we hold." He did not fully believe me. 18 rarely does. The body wants to answer, and the answering feels like honor. But he held, and so did Webb, and so did all of us, through 3 more days of it, and I will tell you that I have been prouder of those young men's stillness than of anything I ever did with a rifle. There was one more thing I noticed in those days, and it mattered, though I did not yet know why. The old general, the white-headed one who had gone still under the arch on the first morning, did not laugh at any of it. When Stahl performed his cruelty, the old man's face would close like a door, and once I saw him take Stahl aside and say something low and hard, and Stahl shrug it off the way a younger man shrugs off an older one he has decided is past his time. The old general watched the host guards with a quality of attention I could not place, not amusement, not pity. Something more like a man trying to remember where he has seen a face. He watched me, in particular, more than the others, and I felt it, the way you feel a watcher even with your eyes fixed on a frozen fountain, and I could not have told you what it meant. I found out at the state dinner on the last night. The treaty was to be signed in the morning, and the night before there was a great dinner in the Aldsworth Long Hall. The household and the ministers and the whole of the Carthan delegation under the old hammer-beam roof and the banners and 1,000 candles. Guardsmen of my regiment held the ceremonial posts inside the hall that night, at the doors, along the walls, behind the high table, in full dress, motionless, part of the architecture of the occasion. I had the post behind and to the right of the high table, near the king, an honor and a punishment both, because it meant I stood through the whole long dinner 3 paces from the laughter and the wine, and could not so much as shift my weight. And it meant I was standing there, a still red figure against the stone, when Colonel Stahl, well into the wine and the warmth and the admiration of the younger officers, rose to tell a story. He told it well. I will give him that. The man could hold a room. He stood with a glass in his hand and the candlelight on his ribbons, and he said he wanted to speak, on this night of friendship between old enemies, about what real soldiering was, so that the young men present would not mistake the costume for the thing. And he looked, as he said the costume with great deliberation, at the host guards along the walls, at Webb by the door, at me behind the king, at me. And several of the Carthan officers chuckled, and a few of our own people looked at their plates. And then, to illustrate what real soldiering was, Colonel Stahl told the story of the siege of Karrenhold. I want you to imagine standing where I stood. 3 paces away, a man who had spent 5 days calling me a wound-up doll was telling, to a hall of 200 people, the story of the single most secret and most costly thing I had ever done, the thing I had spent 19 years learning to be quiet about, telling it as a parable of everything I was supposedly not. He told it well, and he told it wrong in all the ways that legends go wrong, which is to say he made it grand where it had been only cold and sick and terrible. He told of the 11 weeks, the bowl of mountains, the gun on the eastern shoulder, the 3 columns that died on the road. He told of the impossible range and the impossible cold. And then he came to the part he loved, the part his voice dropped and slowed for, and he said, "There was one man. We do not know his name. Vasmark has never given it, and I have asked at the highest levels because I would give a great deal to shake that man's hand. One man on the western ridge at 1100 meters in a wind that would have made any soldier in this room miss the mountain itself. One shot. And the gun fell silent and the road opened, and a town that was 11 weeks dead lived. We teach him at our college. We call him the Marksman of Karrenhold. He is the finest rifleman of the age, and no one alive knows his face." He raised his glass. He looked one more time with that small permanent contempt along the wall of still red guardsmen. "That," he said, "is a soldier. Not," and he gestured with the glass lazily at the lot of us, at me, "this." And in the silence after, before the polite applause could start, the old white-headed general stood up. He stood up slowly, the way he did everything, with his hands flat on the table to lift himself, and the hall quieted further because an old man rising slowly commands a room more than a young one shouting. He looked at Stahl, and then he turned deliberately and he looked at me, 3 paces behind the king, holding my horizon, giving nothing, a wound-up doll at a gilt dinner. "Reinhardt," the old general said, in a voice that carried without effort because it had carried across worse places than a dinner, "put down your glass." Stahl blinked. "General Roeder." "Put it down." He put it down. The old general, General Roeder, I learned his name only then, came out from behind the high table. He walked, slow and certain, past the king, who watched him with an old man's interested patience, and he came to stand in front of me, close, the way Stahl had stood in the court but with everything reversed, and he looked up into my face under the bearskin, and I held the horizon because I was on duty, and a guardsman does not break for a general any more than for a colonel. But General Roeder was not trying to make me break. He was reading me, and after a long moment he said, very quietly, just to me, in the old soldier's voice that is below the level of a room, "I was at Karrenhold. I was inside the bowl. I was one of the men on the road who would have died on the 4th column." He paused. "I have spent 30 years wondering what kind of man could make that shot, and I have spent 5 days watching a colonel of my own army flick his glove at the only man in this hall who has the stillness it would take." His old eyes searched my face. "I am going to ask you one question, Sergeant, and you may answer or not as your honor tells you. But I think I already have my answer because I have only ever seen that quiet in one kind of man." He drew himself up and he asked it not as a trap but as a tribute. "Was it you, on the western ridge? Was it you?" I want to tell you that I had a noble speech ready. I did not. I had 19 years of silence and a discipline that said give nothing, and the discipline did not know what to do with being asked, by the right man in the right way, a true thing. So I did the only honest thing, which was a very small thing. I looked at General Roeder, let my eyes come off the horizon and settle, for the first time in 5 days, on a human face, and I held his gaze, and I said nothing at all, but I let him see that there was a man in there, and that the man had been on a cold ridge once, and that the legend in his war college had a heart that was still beating 3 paces behind the king of Vazmark. And the old general, who had been on the road that would have made the 4th column, who would have died in the open under the gun on the eastern shoulder if a frightened sick young man had not made one impossible shot, General Roeder came to attention. An old man, slow in everything, came to full attention in the middle of the Aldsworth long hall, and he raised his hand and he saluted me. He held it, and his eyes were wet, and he did not care who saw. The hall did not understand, not all at once, but 200 people watched the senior soldier of the Carthan delegation salute a wall-post guardsman and hold it. And they are not fools, the people who go to such dinners, and a wave of understanding moved across that room, slow and total as the cold off the river. The king turned in his chair and looked at me with an expression I had never been given in 19 years of his service. Not the kindly notice a king gives a good servant, but the still regard one man gives another across a great distance of rank, the regard you give a thing you did not know you were standing near. And Colonel Reinhard Stahl, who had asked at the highest levels to shake the hand of the Marksman of Karrenhold, who had spent 5 days flicking his glove at that same hand, stood at the high table with the blood gone out of his face and understood what he had done. I will not pretend I felt nothing watching it. I am a man. But what I felt was not triumph, and I think that surprised me more than anything. I had imagined in some low part of myself across those 5 days a moment like this, the unmasking, the reckoning, the colonel's face. And now it was here, and there was no sweetness in it, only a kind of tired pity, because I saw, watching him, understand that the cruelty had never really been about us at all. A man who reveres the Marksman of Karrenhold and spends his days mocking still men at a gate is a man at war with something in himself, and the something had just caught up with him in front of 200 people, and there is no victory in watching that. There is only the cold of the river and the long, flat country of the mind, and the knowledge that you held. Stahl did not finish his speech. He sat down. The dinner went on around the great silence at its center, the way dinners do, and I held my post until the king withdrew and the hall emptied, and I was relieved at last and went out into the frozen court and stood a moment under the king's arch in the dark, alone, looking at the lime tree with its one black leaf, and let the 5 days go out of me into the cold. There is a little more, and then I am done. In the morning, before the treaty signing, Colonel Stahl came to the regimental range below the east wall, where I had been asked quietly, by the king's own request, with no audience but the men who needed to be there to settle a thing. The general had wanted it. The king had allowed it. I had agreed for one reason only, which I will tell you in a moment. It was not a contest. There was no one to beat. There was a target set at a distance the range was barely long enough to hold. And a service rifle I had not touched in 19 years, cold and strange and familiar all at once in my hands, the way an old grief is, and a small gray morning with no wind to speak of, which is the easiest kind and the kind I would have given my hands to have had on the western ridge. I did not want to do it. I want that on the record. The whole of my discipline for 19 years had been never the other thing again, and here they were asking me to do the other thing once for proof. I almost refused, and then I understood why I would not refuse, and it had nothing to do with Stahl. It was for Daly, for Webb, for the young men who had stood through 5 days of a glove flicked in their faces and had held on my word, on my promise that the holding was the honor and not the shame. They had taken it from me without knowing it was for me. I owed them the truth of what they had been guarding, not the colonel, the young men, so that the next time some clever, cruel man decided a still soldier is an empty one, Daly would stand there and hold, and inside, where it counts, he would know. So I made the shot. One round, the way it had always been one round. I will not describe it. The target fell. The range was very quiet. Colonel Stahl, who had asked at the highest levels to shake the hand of the man who fired the shot at Karrenhold, came across the cold ground to me, and he was not the same man who had walked the Ashford court owning everyone's time. He stopped a correct distance away. He had learned in one night what distance was for, and he came to attention, and he saluted me, and his voice when it came was low and even and stripped of everything but the words. "Sergeant," he said, "I have spent 5 days proving I do not know a soldier when I am standing in front of one. There is no apology that mends that, but I owe you the words and you will have them in front of these men. I was wrong about you, about all of them." He glanced once at Webb and at Daly standing by the firing point and back to me. "Forgive an old fool his glove." I returned his salute, because the discipline returns a salute, and because a man who has come that far down off his own height has earned the small grace of being met halfway. I did not make him grovel. There is no honor in grinding a humbled man, and a guardsman least of all should want it. I said the only thing I said to him in 5 days. "It was a cold morning on the ridge, Colonel," I said, "same as this one. A man does what's in front of him and then he spends the rest of his life learning to stand still. The standing still is the harder of the two. Your young men are watching how you take this. Take it well." And I gave the rifle back to the range sergeant, and I never fired one again, and I never will. They signed the treaty. The delegation left by the river road, and General Roeder, going slowly down the steps, stopped under the King's Arch where it had begun and looked up at me on my post and put his hand to his cap, an old man to a still man, one more time, and I held my horizon and let him see the man inside lift, just slightly, to meet it. And then the cars were gone down the river road, and the visit was over and the cold went on, and I stood my 2 hours and was relieved and stood them again. I am an old man myself now, older than Roeder was that winter. They have a younger sergeant on the King's Arch these days, and I hear he is a good one, and I hear that on hard mornings he tells the young ones a thing about a colonel and a glove, though I do not think he knows the whole of it, and it is better that he does not. The legend in the war colleges still has no face. That is as I want it. The Marksman of Karrenhold is a problem in wind and elevation and nerve, taught to young officers in 2 countries, and not one of them knows that he came down off the ridge sick behind a rock, and went and found the quietest gate in the kingdom, and stood at it for 19 years learning the harder discipline. So when you pass one of us, at a gate, in the cold, in the bearskin and the red wool, eyes fixed on a horizon you cannot see, I will ask you only to remember one thing, which is the thing it took me a war and 19 winters and 1 arrogant colonel to be sure of. The stillness is never the emptiness. It is the fullest thing about the man. He is not a coat hung on a frame for you to photograph. He is holding something you cannot see, and the holding of it without spending it on you is the whole of what he is for. The loudest thing I ever did was 1 shot on a cold ridge. Everything since has been the discipline of standing still, and I will tell you, now that I am old and may say it plainly, that the standing still was the braver of the 2.